as I said on Twitter, I'm going to do a little bit of a discussion around why I believe EU is better than NA. I'm going to talk about various different points that I've observed over the last 7 to 8 years of Rocket League esports, some of which are less factual and more speculative. I've left out really speculative things like, for example, the cultural differences, like how parents are, like what schools are like, the video gaming culture. I haven't even included stuff like the fact that football/soccer and cars are more of like a European thing, because all that kind of stuff, I don't think it's as relevant in this discussion. It could be a factor, but this is something that's seen across a lot of esports, not just in Rocket League, and there's a lot of reasons for it. So I thought I would go through some of the points here. So the first one that's I think the most important one in my mind is the culture of a multilingual region. Europe obviously being made up of multiple countries speaking different languages versus North America, which is many states that are all kind of intermingled when it comes to the online world. Of course, France is a big factor. And we'll go into that on greater detail. Role models, who are those people and why they've led to their regions being stronger. More competitive for less money, that's a classic thing that you see in Europe versus North America. The rank differences, and then the fact that depth has improved depth over time. The content culture, and then some recent changes that I believe have led to the largest dominance in recent history of Europe, and then we'll conclude with a few little comments after that. There's not going to be any gameplay analysis here. There's not going to be a huge amount of stuff on this slideshow. I've literally chucked this together with just some prompts from me mostly. It's more about what I'm saying. So if you want to put this on in the background while you're doing something, maybe grinding free play if you're European, or if you're North American, I guess grinding ranked. I don't know what the differences are there. But let's get into the culture of multilingual regions. So one thing I've observed as a coach of players from multiple different languages is that every different nation has their own little community. So I've just highlighted a few examples here in NA versus EU. Obviously, US and Canada, I feel like, I don't even know if there's a huge amount of like Canadians sticking out for Canadians in America, but there is an element of, if you're in the USA, you're all in the USA online. I don't know if there's a huge amount of like West Coast people hanging out with West Coast people, Texans hanging out with Texans. Obviously now some people have moved to Austin. There's an element of camaraderie there. But I don't think there's a huge amount of localized support. Whereas in Europe, we have discords for each of the nations, multiple discords, in fact. For example, when I was coaching Tho, he was in a Dutch discord where all the Dutch pros and potential future pros, coaches, personalities were all in there. Not many people at all, but there would just be only Dutch people in there, and they would talk about their teams, their struggles, share experiences, play games together, all that kind of stuff. Same thing is true for every nation. I don't know so much about Germany and Spain, but I assume it's the same case there, where the Spanish players stick together, German players stick together, and of course the French players are very well known for sticking together, the French-speaking players anyway. Same thing is true in the UK. Now, France is even bigger on this scale, but what this leads to is you get that mentorship from the top players who have access, or I guess the lower level players have access to the top players from their nation way earlier than people in North America do. Now, this obviously isn't completely the case for everyone. Like, I know some of the top players in North America are friends with younger players, lower ranked players, but if you're a young French player and you want access to KDOP when he was in his prime, you could play ranked with KDOP. You were in his stream, he would chat with you, you'd be in a separate Discord playing games with him, and so on and so on. Same thing is true of Fairy Peak and all the other French pros. And, they would snipe each other, they would have all this interaction, and it would be a much closer-knit community where the gap between the top talent and the rising talent was not as big. And so, consequently, those young 13, 15, 14, 16, all the young age groups, I don't know why I say it in that order, would get access to these top players, and consequently would be able to play in tournaments with them. Similar things kind of true in the UK. At Insomnia, we had some of that, like Scrub Killer and Bluey both played at Insomnia's before they turned 15. Joyo, I believe, played there. So there's an element of that on the UK LAN scene, and I assume it's similar across all of the other nations as well. So that mentorship is a big factor, and I wanted to show an example of this because this is where I sort of first started to notice it. Was back when I was coaching Vitality quite early on. I decided to play in a Gfinity. This isn't me trying to brag about me playing, but it's just a very fond memory, one that stands out in my mind. And in this tournament, Epsilon, Fakeow, interesting, is Atto's older brother. So there's another example of a mentor. D7 content creator now. There was Moot Gang. So the French teams would often play under this name, would often play in French land tournaments like this. And this was Ferry Peak, who was at the time one of the best players in the world, playing with Cassio, an up-and-coming player in France. I think he was playing around Triple Trouble on this at this time. I think that was sort of that kind of era, maybe just before then. And then this young 14-year-old player, Alpha 54, who is the most recent world champion and has been a superstar player for a long time. And they played together in this tournament, and I hadn't even heard of Alpha 54 at this time, and I was coaching an RLCS team. So, like, who's this young player playing? And I was playing in the tournament with Flame and Speed, who were both up-and-coming UK players at the time. Flame on Team Secret, Speed, I believe, was on Unilad at this time, just about to join Bricks. And I was playing with these guys at the time. And I remember playing them in the final and being like, my goodness, this Alpha guy's unbelievable. Where's he been found? And of course, he's just part of the French community. And a similar kind of thing you can see here, like the Arju here, early days. So an Italian team sticking together. I know this isn't always the same, but like Scandinavian players often hang out together, and also often hang out with English-speaking players, because it's like that English-speaking part of Europe. And at the time, you got the two Dutch guys, Rix. Rix did a lot of scouting of younger players and supporting them by getting them on teams. In fact, I believe he picked up Speed in the future after some good results against them. And so you can see a lot of that culture early on here. Not all the teams are the same. But even if you're on a multilingual team, multi-regional team, those individuals will be able to connect with their peers and other teams. So, like, for example, if you're, like I mentioned the Dutch players before, if you're Tho and you're the only Dutch player on Guild, you then have your Dutch friends who you can, talk about the things you're struggling with, get advice, all that kind of stuff. So you get that similar thing that we see with, Arsenal mentioned it in the interviews that we did at RLCS. He mentioned that he felt like he was a better person because he lived with Roldiz and Nolly, who were on other teams, and he could, talk with them about stuff. So, speaking of which, the French players were in a lot of the interviews, obviously because there's a lot of them. But I believe a lot of the French players, I have anecdotal evidence of why they got so good. And a lot of it comes down to Rocket Baguettes, their community around it, and having that centralized location for tournaments, playing in tournaments. Rocket Baguettes do a lot of French lands and all that kind of stuff. They've got a centralized community, they've got a French stream and so on, but a lot of it comes down to this guy. So KDOP was, like, at the same time as Topolsa, was considered the GOAT. 6 back-to-back world finals, 3 world championship titles, joined Vitality, the biggest French org at the time, and consequently you had your biggest French personality, the biggest streamer. He's a very good streamer as well. It's hard to understand it if you don't speak French, but he's very entertaining, very good player at the time, had a very good role model mindset. He got himself in shape, he grinded, he worked hard, he had a good attitude towards the game. He wasn't happy unless he was winning, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of good role models there. He also grinded a lot of ranked and would get stream sniped by French pros, would team up with up-and-coming French pros. There would be a lot of that, like, French players grinding together attitude. And, pretty much all the French players would be in the chat and so on and so on. And I do remember back when Zen was on his rise, seeing him involved in KDOP streams. A lot of French players over the times would just play with KDOP on stream. Radosin, before Radosin joined Vitality with KDOP, was grinding ranked with KDOP. I mean, Ferry Peak and KDOP used to grind together, and then they end up being teammates again. All that kind of stuff. So definitely a huge factor there for France, and that's why the French community has done so well, just because they have that great role model, early access to pros. There's a lot of them, so they get good practice together, and they can share resources together. So if we look at the sorry, I spoke about role models just there. So if we look at the two sort of top teams from the last season, the whole season, in fact, you can look at the top teams across both sides, and you can start scrolling through them and sort of think of, like, who's got superstar players and who's got content creators. And if you start looking through NA, you can see a lot more examples of entertainers. Like, I know it's not a great example, but Gen G has an EU player in Appjack. Part of the reason why he moved to NA was knowing that he could get a better contract for being a largely followed player, and obviously being involved in the content out there. I'm sure that was a big factor for why he moved out there. And then you have a few teams like FaZe, Complexity, G2. They are winning teams, right? They don't have a huge amount of content around them. They're more about winning. So they're examples of the winner team. And then you've got this whole bunch of teams. If we ignore Furix, obviously they're an import team, but Space Station, massively content focused. Version 1, as an org, have been content focused, but as a team, less so. But, you know, Optic, content creator, NRG, 3 big content creators. And so there's a lot more content creation in North American region, and has been historically. You know, there's some coaches that are quite heavily involved in content. And the reason why that's the case is because content does well out in North America, whereas across in Europe, you know, it's very hard to find any big content creators. And those who do are inconsistent streamers from time to time, right? So the difference is definitely there. And this is just mostly due to the culture. Like, EU pros, their focus is more, we grind the game to win, where a lot of the NA pros, it's more, we grind the game to build our brand and, you know, make money, etc. And that's a big generalization, but it's definitely something that's observable across all of esports. NA tends to have the bigger names, the bigger creators, more popular players, and so on. And that is just due to the difference in the culture around esports in NA and EU. So that's less of a Rocket League specific thing and more just across all of esports. And I do believe that content isn't the best way to win. It's still a fantastic thing, a very important thing in esports. I'm not trying to say it's not. And in fact, I encourage more people to do content where if you enjoy it, but it doesn't result in winning as much. They're not mutually exclusive, but there tends to be a trend of those who do content struggle to keep up and go through much more fluctuation in general unless they have a good balance on it. So if we look at the more competitive for less money ideas, so this is something that's spoken about a little bit, and it has definitely balanced out a bit more in recent history, and I think it's still the case, but there's definitely less of a gap. At times in the past, there was a massive gap between NA and EU, but the salaries are higher in North America. I've just realized because of the way I reformatted this suddenly before I went. This was literally the most scrappiest PowerPoint ever. Hopefully you can read this all right. But EU on the left, NA on the right, and then down the middle we've got the topics. So salary is higher in NA. The depth is definitely higher in Europe. There is more teams that could win or could beat top teams in Europe, and has been the case for a long time. So that makes it more competitive. Orgs paying for lower teams. You know, if we go back to that previous slide, there's a lot bigger orgs paying down here than in EU. I think this last season, it was definitely like the season where we saw a lot more orgs coming in, but you know, the EU has typically struggled a little bit to get those, like teams like SUH. I mean, Lunar Galaxy only got signed towards the end. PSG Tundra are unsigned for a while. G1 don't even get paid. So like, in terms of the lower teams getting paid is a whole different thing. The other tournament prize pool, so this is tournaments outside of RLCS. You know, the prize pool tends to be a lot higher and tends to be more leaning towards content creators. So if you're a pro player as a content creator, you often get access to stuff in NA. Again, this is just observing. It will fluctuate from time to time. But in general, there is more tournaments with high prize pool in NA. And the ones that have less prize pool tend to have much lower quality teams in it, where in Europe, you know, top teams will be happily playing in lower prize pool tournaments. Content monetization, this is obviously much higher in NA, so it makes it more money for NA teams. And then ranked is stronger in EU versus NA, which is, it's hard to say why that is, but there's a lot of evidence from people experiencing it through coming over for LANs, etc. And in general, just if you observe the gameplay, you can tend to see it. It's definitely a different style to it. So let's get on to ranked and talk about that, because I think all those stuff we've spoken about before, you know, it's essentially there's more money in NA and less competition, right? And the depth in Europe comes from the multilingual nature of it and all these little mini pockets and communities that develop young talent. And so therefore you have more stronger teams outside of those top teams. And another thing is ranked then gets improved. So the more high level players there are in ranked, the stronger your region gets. Because if your ranked games down from number 1 through to 1000 are high quality, that's much better than top players in North America, who are relying on the best players in the world to play ranked, and a lot of them don't as well. So one of the big factors for me is that EU plus MENA is much stronger a cohort of players than NA plus SAM, and is also, I didn't put this in here, but I do believe ping has a part to play in the difference, but it's a really hard thing to prove. There's a lot of the best NA players are on West Coast, where they're playing with essentially the equivalent of MENA ping. And South American players are a lot further away, so they play with even higher than MENA ping. NA players often will have 50 to 70 ping, depending if they're central and so on. Where Europe, the majority of the player base are based in that northwest part of Europe. The majority of the competitive player base anyway. Your France's, your Germany's, UK's, Netherlands, Scandinavia to an extent. Obviously, it gets a bit different the further away you get. Even like Spain, geographically, is a lot closer than somewhere like Texas, I believe. So the ping factor is meaning the quality of practice is definitely better there. And then consequently have less lag problems, which is demotivating. Like, I find it really hard playing on NA, and I got 80 ping when I play on US East, and I find that hard to play good quality Rocket League. And you often see that in the playstyles, right? So there's a playstyle thing across all of the regions that you tend to see. So MENA, very chasey, very pre-jumpy, and very mechanical on the ball, play very fast, right? Similar thing in South America. The high ping regions that play in Europe and North America tend to have very similar play styles. This has changed more now. There's RLCS to develop those play styles into a more mature play style. But anyway, in Europe, people are much more comfortable in the micro game, where you're playing for 50-50s, fakes, forces, reading of the ball and that kind of thing, reading of the play, because they play on much more true ping, closer to zero. Where in NA, a lot of those players and the quality of the servers and stuff for each individual means that they have that inconsistency. It's very hard to keep playing at the highest quality of gameplay, because I've watched NA players versus EU streams, and like EU streamers will stick it around 20 ping for a whole evening and not have a bad server, whereas an NA player will go from like a server where it's rubber banding just based off of geography a lot of the time. So I do think there's a difference in ping, and that's something I wanted to bring up, but I don't know. There's no real way to prove it. I just know from when I've played NA a lot, I've tended to become quite a lot more pre-jumpy, a lot more on the ball focused. And one of the biggest difference we see between the two when discussed in Twitter, and this is a great example of it, I blocked the F words, but I just realised Arsenal was sworn twice in that tweet. Anyway, NA ranked is so ass. We are never beating EU. And then Rettel said challenging the ball is terrible in NA. So that's to do. I think that's to do with a little bit with how people play and the ping, and like even like how people react around it. Like people are much more drive away from the play, get 100 boost, wait for the ball to come to them, and then do a solo play focus. So you can see there, Arsenal says, saying people at the back, they try to control every touch. So one thing I've noticed with NA is they tend to try and go for solo plays and like air dribbles and all these like crazy things, whereas Europe are a lot more like focused around the challenge game, like just constantly in the face of the player. And you can see that in the top 4 teams at the most recent RLCS, if the way they all play is just constant pressure, constant chasing, recovery, chasing, recovery, chasing, recovery. And that's been something that's been spawned through the rank system, I believe. So I think that's a factor. I don't know how much you can say it's a factor based off of the players, and how much of a factor is based off of the history with the internet and the pings, and the play style that's sort of developed over time, because there is an element of counter play styles and developing that, and that's what Gen G claimed to have done to an extent, went to NA and had a European play style that countered the region a bit. We've also then got the discussion of depth improving depth. So EU has historically been a deeper region. During the online era, RLCS X, we had a lot of runs from teams who were unsigned, teams who are much lower. Recently, we had Hogan mode, right? Growly, Resi, and Scrub Killer, coming in and getting top 4, top 3, I think it was even. And you've had, like, last season, we had Solary with Tho, Oli, Mike Boy, I think it was, which made an amazing run, having not previously played together a team, all this kind of stuff. And then, obviously, Liquid came out of nowhere, the original Kesa roster of Vatira, Rise, and Joyo. These teams seem to appear out of nowhere and grow very quickly and can beat top teams. And so, of course, if you've got a deeper region where teams 1 through 16 are strong, that improves the quality of your scrim practice each week. It improves the quality of your tournament practice. It means that you have to be much better, otherwise you're at risk in like the Swisses to take some losses that could go against you. So that means that you have to be more professional. You have to be even better to guarantee the wins. You can't just get away with being a top 8 team and then securing a major and so on. And then what we saw with the import players coming to NA with like Furia, Complexity, and Gen G is that pushed out your regulars, like your NRGs. Like if they weren't there, NRG would be making LAN, right? Your NRGs, your G2s, and your FaZe, etc. Like those kind of big names from the RLCS X era would all be making LAN still if it wasn't for those import teams. So you that depth definitely pushes the top teams to be even better. And like I know that in NA, a lot of these top teams, they scrim each other a lot rather than scrimming the depth, because the quality of the scrims is so much worse once they start going into that 12th through 24 teams, where EU, like when I used to coach, I mean it's different now, but when I used to coach, we used to scrim pretty much every team making regionals, like we could do anyway. So where I've stuck through, so depth definitely improves depth. And then another topic to talk about would be content culture. And I don't want to go too much into this because I think this is actually a positive for NA and something that we should definitely encourage and not discourage. But there's definitely more of a mindset around content in NA. You know, top players, they do gain a big following on YouTube. You know, just look at Rettles and Arsenal, for example. Like, they put content out there, people will watch it, people enjoy North American creators. Being English speakers, you've got a much bigger reach across the world, and you know the whole of the North American region can watch NA teams. I haven't even spoken about like the reason why sponsors is better in NA, which is something that I'll just bring up now briefly. So it's a lot easier for NA events, teams, etc. to get sponsors, because if an NA brand wants to sponsor an NA creator, that NA creator's audience will be still majority North America in an English-speaking creator. Whereas when you look in Europe, if you have an English-speaking creator or an English-speaking RLCS stream, it's a lot harder to get a sponsorship, because each of these sponsorship pots in Europe for all these big brands is split by the different nations. You have an English, like let's just take a big brand, for example, like Adidas or Nike or something like that, right? They have a UK branch, a French branch, a German branch, an Italian branch, and so on. And if they want to sponsor an event, they have to sponsor an event knowing it's going to target their audience that they're meant to market to. Whereas in North America, they have one Adidas US, right, that sponsors events in the US, and therefore they can hit all of them. Same with car manufacturers, right? Even though if it's a brand that's in every country, it'd still value their brand across the board, but that's not what their sponsorship money goes towards. This is why you can see like the French community does quite well, the orgs do quite well, because they can very easily target French community, French market. They can have a French brand, like Orange is a sponsor on K-Corp. K-Corp are sponsored by one of the biggest phone providers in France. It's not outside of France, but it makes sense there, right? So content culture, you can make more money, get better sponsors in NA. You got a larger audience, viewership tends to be higher, and so on. So players are encouraged to stream and so on, which is a positive thing for the esport. But it does mean that playing on stream is not ideal for improvement, right? Like you're not streaming gameplay to improve, you're streaming gameplay to entertain. And obviously you will improve by playing a lot, but you can get in bad habits too. You can get burnt out, you can get tired, fatigued, and so on. Like there is a lot of negative elements potentially to streaming. I know for a lot of players, that's what allows them to actually get the hours up. Otherwise they wouldn't do it. So, there is some positives to it in that way, but ultimately playing on stream is not the ideal solution to improve, right? So there is some recent improvements. So we just saw the top 4 at the most recent RLCS beat Europe. And I think it's fair to say that wasn't just because of the history of Europe. I think we've seen some recent changes that's improved Europe beyond that of the past gap, and that's why we saw top 4 being European, and we've got that big 4 in Europe and plus Moist, etc. So one of the big things, in my opinion, is the training facilities. So BDS were the first team to really adopt the training facility method. Consequently, have been one of the most successful orgs ever since they joined the esport, being world champion, runner-up world champion, LAN winners, LAN finals, multiple regional winners, etc. And Vitality, you can see there, that's the Stade de France facility that came in just when I left Vitality, so end of 2019. And they're both amazing facilities where you get much more focused improvement. You can accelerate change. I think I asked this in my press conference, which if you haven't checked out, check out Beyond the Game podcast, which is my podcast channel where I'll get a podcast with lots of Rocket League people coming up soon. But you can also check out the press conferences that happened at the most recent RLCS. So a lot of the answers in there give clues to this discussion. One of them being Mew, I think it was, mentioned that these training facilities allow you to accelerate change. So they allow you to speed up the process of improvement, speed up the process of dealing with issues. You know, like if there's an issue in scrims and you all just go offline because you're playing from home, you leave it till the next day, it can carry over and so on. But if you leave scrims and you're there with your players face to face, you can sort it out there and then. It's a lot easier to sort those things out. You know, like if there's outside of the game stuff you want to implement with your players, like health and fitness, psychology and so on, you can do that in person. So you can accelerate that whole process. I think it all makes sense. I'm sure you're all aware of it. There is negatives, you know, living away from home and so on, so it's less comfortable. But this could potentially be why Gen G did so well, because for Jack and Nolly, they essentially adopted a training facility approach by moving to a new country, right? No longer at home, no longer in the comfort of their parents' house and so on. Not that Nolly was like that at the end of... Anyway, it doesn't matter. Another thing to mention, and I spoke to Neo, who's the owner of Vitality. Spoke to him a little bit about the success of the most recent Vitality team. And he said one of the big things for him was that they got to meet the CSGO team. So Vitality CSGO team, one of the most successful CSGO teams in history. And, you know, they train in the same facilities. So they got to know each other. They got to hang out together, got to learn from each other. And for the Rocket League players, they get to see what being a true esports professional is like, because our tier 1 esports, Rocket League is not a tier 1 esport just yet, although it is an amazing esport, it doesn't really matter. But CSGO, Valorant, League of Legends, even some of the other esports like Overwatch, they've adopted a tier 1 mindset to performance where they have training facilities. They're much more intense. They scrim a lot more. They play a lot harder. And so for a Rocket League team to be surrounded by that kind of culture, it definitely induces a lot more hard-working attitude. And I know that when we won the Season 7 RLCS Worlds in 2019, 2 weeks before that at DreamHack Dallas, we went for dinner with the CSGO team of Vitality, and it was eye-opening for the players. They suddenly realised how hard they need to work, what it takes to be at the top, and all that kind of stuff. So definitely a big factor by being in a training facility. I know Liquid go to the Liquid HQ a lot for boot camps. K-Corp go to the K-Corp HQ too. So there's definitely that side of EU that's improving it. And obviously Zen coming in, setting a new standard with Vitality. I believe their scrim results were unreal for a few months when Zen came in. So that definitely pushed the whole region. You know, it was the same when BDS first came in. We never beat BDS in scrims until we started going even with them, and then we eventually beat them in a tournament, right? Like that's how much it took us, like almost 6 months to ever even come close to them in scrims. And then once we did, that's when we started beating them in tournaments, right? Like playing against a good scrim opponent is a big factor. And this is what a lot of people are talking about with APAC and, you know, I can't think of, I mean, North America, I guess, having import players, but the import player approach, improving the quality of scrims and so on, it does have a factor to an extent. And so that's a different topic, but yeah, it's definitely something to think about. So in conclusion, I'm not going to go into too much depth, but there's a lot of factors here that I've spoken through. I haven't even gone through the Twitter thread. In fact, I can probably do that now while we're finishing up. But the conclusion essentially is just that EU is better than NA. And if we look through this thread here, you know, there's a lot of like dumb responses, like Stack saying the water. He's obviously saying it's a bit of a joke. But there's a lot of things about like culture. You know, way rank 2s is played as a big factor. But there's also a lot of just speculation of like, you know, egos, you know, NA players being more individual based off of the culture in the country, whereas Europe's more team focused. Europe's more winning focused and less about the ego. So there's lots of stuff in here, and if you want to check that out, go to my Twitter and check here. But who knows what the biggest factors are, but I think for me, from that whole thing, the biggest factor is the multilingual community-based system that we see in Rocket League, and seeing all of these top teams working together with the new talent coming through. As I mentioned, this has been happening for years and years and years. Young players are getting nurtured by top pros from their country, because the gap between a top national pro and an up-and-coming bubble player is much smaller than a top North American pro and an up-and-coming bubble player there, where they have, several teams worth of players between them and the bottom. And so you don't see that as much there. So if you've got any ideas, put them down in the description below. If you like this kind of, I want to say low editing, low budget, just discussion based video where I'm essentially just talking for like what's been 30 minutes with a PowerPoint in the background, let me know. I can do more of this in the future. But I want to hear what you think. So let me know why you believe it's the case, and let me know if there's any other topics you want me to discuss like this. But I hope you enjoyed RLCS Worlds as much as I did. And like I said, go check out the press conferences on Beyond the Game. See ya!